On Sunday, October 15th, 2017, the all-powerful American pharmaceutical industry suddenly discovered that for once it had met its match. Its match was journalism. Its match was truth-telling. Its match was the patient accumulation of facts. Its match was a free press. And in this case, its match was a partnership between two great journalistic institutions. Early that morning, the Sunday edition of the Washington Post, one of the Earth's iconic newspapers, landed on front porches all over the capital city and its suburbs and lit up computer screens and mobile phones all over the world. The Post that day featured a triumph of investigative reporting, a compelling indictment of corporate callousness and legislative malpractice, of political corruption and governmental indifference, of a Washington lobbying industry that in this case seems less like gleaming, prosperous K Street than like a dark alley littered with glassine envelopes and used needles. It's a story about how all of this contributed to the deaths of thousands of people, victims of an opioid epidemic that could have been far less deadly than it has been. Then the evening of that same day, Sunday, October 15th, the Post passed the ball to television's premier news magazine, CBS's 60 Minutes, which, as of this year, has been on the air for 50 years. That's half a century, believe it or not. 60 Minutes devoted the opening two segments of its October 15th edition to the same story, a story that the program had reported out in full partnership with a newspaper and with the same professionalism and dedication to the truth.
Much has been reported on the human toll of the opioid crisis. More than 350,000 Americans have died of overdoses in the first 16 years of this century. That's about 116 deaths a day. But we wanted to take a look at the role corporations play. Our team interviewed dozens of people, dug through public records, filed suit in federal court to get our hands on others. All of the digging and documents might have left us with a pile of paper in a hole if not for former DEA Deputy Assistant Administrator Joe Ranasisi, our whistleblower. He was a no-nonsense federal employee who saw Americans by the tens of thousands dying from opioid overdoses. He saw drug distributors shipping tens of millions of opioid pills to pharmacies in small towns across the country. Many of them ended up on the streets, sold on the black market. When he tried to hold the drug distributors, Fortune 500 companies, accountable, he found his efforts stymied by a law passed by Congress at the height of the opioid epidemic that tied the DEA's hands and allowed distributors to keep shipping pills with little fear of retribution. While the legislation was making its way through Congress, the pharmaceutical industry spent more than $100 million lobbying lawmakers. In our second piece, Too Big to Prosecute, former DEA Assistant Special Agent David Schiller told us when his team caught the country's largest drug distributor and fifth largest corporation, McKesson, shipping massive quantities of opioids despite repeated warnings, he wanted to send a message and fine McKesson $1 billion. But Schiller told us DEA lawyers, intimidated by McKesson's deep pockets and high-powered legal team, settled for a $150 million fine instead. Schiller called that a slap on the wrist for a company that earns $100 million a week in profits. These stories had an impact. 2 days after our first report, Congressman Tom Marino, who sponsored the bill that tied DEA's hands, withdrew his name from nomination as President Trump's drug czar. Just today, executives of 5 drug distributors were called before Congress. One admitted his company played a role in the opioid epidemic. The others said they bore no responsibility at all. Meanwhile, in Ohio federal court, hundreds of municipalities from across the country are suing opioid makers and distributors for what the judge called this man-made scourge. This award for journalism in service of the common good is a tremendous honor, and all of us, we thank you.